They called you sensitive. They said you cared too much. They told you that you were too intense, too emotional, too invested in people who never deserve a fraction of your energy. And you believe them because you were raised to think your ability to feel everything was a weakness rather than what it actually is, which is a survival mechanism that got weaponized against you. And Carl Jung knew this. He documented this exact pattern in his clinical work. He saw how empaths don't stop trusting people because they're damaged or broken or incapable of connection. They stop trusting people because they finally learned to trust themselves. And what they learned about human nature through decades of being used as emotional dumping grounds made them realize that most people don't want connection. They want extraction. They don't want relationship. They want resource. And the moment you understand this at a cellular level, the moment you integrate this truth into your psyche, everything changes. You don't become cold. You become discerning. You don't become closed. You become sovereign. And that terrifies people who benefited from your boundaryless compassion. So let's talk about why empath loners aren't antisocial. They're psychologically awake. Carl Jung spent his career understanding something that most people refuse to acknowledge about empaths, which is that what looks like a spiritual gift is actually a trauma response that developed in childhood. And this is not to diminish the real capacity for deep feeling and intuitive perception that empaths possess, but to understand the origin is to understand why the gift became a curse, and why stopping trust is not pathology, but evolution. Jung recognized that children who grow up in environments where they need to constantly monitor the emotional states of adults to stay safe, children who learn that their survival depends on reading the room, sensing danger before it becomes explicit, predicting adult behavior to avoid chaos or violence or abandonment, these children develop what he called participation mystique, an unconscious identification with others' emotional states that erases the boundary between self and other. You learn to feel what your caregivers were feeling before they even knew they were feeling it. Not because you were psychic, but because your nervous system adapted to threat by becoming hypervigilant to emotional cues. And that adaptation saved you as a child. It allowed you to navigate an unpredictable environment by becoming a human emotional radar system. But here's what nobody tells you. That same adaptation destroys you as an adult because you're still operating as if everyone around you is a potential threat that needs to be monitored, managed, and absorbed. Jung understood that empaths are not born. They are forged in the fire of childhood emotional instability. And what emerges is someone who can feel everything but has no idea where they end and others begin. Someone who takes responsibility for emotions that aren't theirs, who carries pain that belongs to people who won't even acknowledge it, who sacrifices their own well-being to stabilize, people who have no intention of stabilizing themselves. This is why young empaths are absolute disasters in relationships. They attract narcissists and energy vampires and emotionally unavailable people like moths to a flame, not because they're masochistic, but because their nervous system was trained to find danger familiar, to mistake intensity for intimacy, to interpret someone's need as evidence of connection. And so they give and give and give until there's nothing left, and then they blame themselves for not having more to give. Jung saw this pattern repeat across hundreds of patients. The empath who depletes themselves trying to heal people who are committed to their wounds, who absorbs abuse and calls it love, who tolerates disrespect because at least it's attention. And he recognized that the breaking point, the moment when an empath stops trusting people, is not a breakdown. It's a breakthrough. It's the moment when the survival mechanism that saved you as a child finally gets recognized as the prison it became as an adult. The empath who stops trusting people is not closing their heart. They're opening their eyes. They're seeing for the first time that their capacity to feel deeply was never respected. It was exploited. That their willingness to hold space for others' pain was never reciprocated. It was taken for granted that their emotional labor was never valued. It was expected, and this realization is absolutely devastating because it means that most of what you thought was connection was actually extraction. Most of what you thought was love was actually convenience. Most of what you thought was friendship was actually utility. Jung knew that this awakening is so painful that many empaths refuse to go through it. They'd rather keep believing in the goodness of people who consistently prove otherwise. They'd rather keep sacrificing themselves on the altar of potential rather than accept the reality of who someone actually is. But the ones who do go through it, the ones who allow the illusion to shatter completely, they emerge as something entirely different. They don't become cynical. They become clear. They don't lose their empathy. They gain discernment. They don't close off from humanity. They open up to their own humanity first. And that shift is what transforms an empath from a perpetual victim into what Jung called an individuated being. Someone who has integrated the shadow, accepted the truth, and chosen to operate from sovereignty rather than survival. Let's get absolutely specific about what happens in psychology of an empath that leads to the complete withdrawal of trust, because this is not a gradual process. This is a catastrophic event that Jung identified as a confrontation with the shadow. And for empaths, the shadow is not their darkness. It's their denied perception. You've been seeing the truth about people for years, maybe decades. Your intuition has been screaming at you that something is wrong, that this person is using you, that this relationship is one-sided, that you're being taken advantage of, manipulated, gaslit, or just fundamentally disrespected. But you silence that knowing because you were taught that your feelings are too much, that your perceptions are too harsh, that you need to give people the benefit of the doubt, even when they've proven, beyond reasonable doubt, that they don't deserve it. Jung called this a repression of instinct, and for empaths it manifests as a constant override of gut feeling in favor of wishful thinking. You know someone is lying, but you accept their explanation because you don't want to believe someone you care about would deceive you. You know someone is using you, but you rationalize it as I'm going through a hard time. You know you're being disrespected, but you excuse it as miscommunication, and all of this self-betrayal accumulates in your unconscious like psychological debt, and eventually that debt comes due. And when it does, it's not subtle. The breaking point usually comes through one specific, undeniable event, an ultimate betrayal that's so blatant you can't rationalize it away. A betrayal from someone you trusted completely, someone you had defended to your death, someone you thought knew you and valued you, and then you discover the infidelity, the financial deception, the years of lies, the way they talk about you behind your back, the manipulation that was so calculated it could only have been intentional. And in that moment, your entire psychological framework collapses because you realize that you saw the signs all along. You had the information, your intuition was correct, and you ignored it. You betrayed yourself to protect someone who was actively harming you. This is what Jung called the dark night of the ego. And for empaths, it's the moment when you have to confront the horrifying truth that your empathy was not a bridge to connection. It was a weapon used against you. That your capacity to understand everyone's perspective made you vulnerable to people who have no interest in understanding yours. That your willingness to see the best in people blinded you to who they actually are. Recent research from 2024 and 2025 confirms what Jung observed a century ago, that empaths who experience this awakening go through a specific psychological transformation that involves what's now called shadow integration, the process of reclaiming all the parts of yourself you've repressed. And for empaths, the biggest repressed parts are not rage or selfishness, but intellectual clarity, analytical precision, and the capacity to trust your own perception over others' narratives. When the breaking point happens, something extraordinary occurs. Where most people would expect an empath to collapse into hysterical emotion, there's instead a terrifying calm, what Jung called a clarity event, the moment when your emotional intelligence and your analytical mind finally work together instead of against each other. And what emerges is someone who can articulate with surgical precision exactly what happened, exactly how it happened, exactly why it happened, and exactly what it means. You don't rage, you don't attack, you don't seek revenge. You simply speak the truth with such clinical accuracy that it's more devastating than any emotional outburst could ever be. You name the manipulation tactics. You cite specific examples with dates and details. You connect patterns of behavior across years. You expose a gap between their words and their actions with such clarity that denial becomes impossible. And this is not cruelty. This is consciousness. This is what happens when an empath finally stops abandoning their own knowing to preserve someone else's comfort. Let's talk about why Empath-Loners specifically stop trusting people in a way that's different from how other personality types withdraw, because this is something Jung identified in his work on introverted feeling types, which is a category most empaths fall into. When an empath withdraws, it's not because they don't want connection. It's because they realize that most of what passes for connection in society is actually performance, people performing care without actually caring, performing interest without actually being interested, performing depth while remaining entirely on the surface. And empaths can feel this inauthenticity at a cellular level. It's physically painful to engage with people who are pretending, who are going through the social motions without any real presence, who ask how you are, but don't actually want to know. Jung called this the tyranny of the persona, the social mask that people wear to navigate the world. And he recognized that most people are so identified with their persona that they have no access to their authentic self. They don't even know who they are beneath performance. And this is fine for them. They're comfortable with surface-level interaction. They don't need depth. They don't crave authenticity. They're perfectly happy with shallow connection, as long as it serves their social or professional needs. But empaths cannot operate this way. It's not a choice. It's not a preference. It's a fundamental wiring of their psychological system. They need authenticity like they need oxygen. They need depth like they need water. And when they're forced to engage in superficial interaction, it drains them at a level that non-empaths literally cannot comprehend. This is why empaths, after their awakening, often become what society calls loners. They're not antisocial. They're not broken. They're just unwilling to participate in performance anymore. They'd rather be alone than fake connection. They'd rather have 2 real friends and 200 acquaintances. They'd rather spend their time in solitude doing deep work than waste at social events that leave them feeling emptier than when they arrived. Jung was very clear that this withdrawal is not pathology. It's what he called sacred isolation, the necessary period of turning inward to rebuild your psychological foundation after it's been shattered by betrayal and extraction. Recent research from 2025 on empath psychology confirms that this period of isolation serves multiple critical functions. First, it allows your nervous system to recalibrate. When you've been in a constant state of hypervigilance monitoring everyone else's emotional states, your system is chronically dysregulated. Removing yourself from social situations allows your body to finally relax, to come down from the sympathetic nervous system activation that's been running for years or decades, and this physiological reset is absolutely necessary for psychological healing. Second, isolation gives you space to reconstruct your identity separate from your role as emotional support for others. Because here's what happens to empaths. You become so identified with being the one who listens, who helps, who holds space, who fixes, that you lose touch with who you are when you're not needed. You don't know what you want because you spend your entire life attuning to what others want. You don't know what brings you joy because you've been so busy managing everyone else's pain. You don't know your own preferences because you've been so adaptable that you've adapted yourself right out of existence. Jung called this the loss of self to collective, and he saw it as one of the most dangerous psychological states because it leaves you completely vulnerable to manipulation. If you don't know who you are, anyone can tell you who you should be. If you don't know what you want, anyone can convince you to want what serves them. If you don't have a stable sense of self, you'll attach to anyone who seems certain even if their certainty is leading you off a cliff. Now, here's where it gets really interesting from a Jungian perspective, because what happens after clarity event is that empaths develop what contemporary psychology now calls shadow immunity, and this is a term that emerged in 2025 research on narcissistic abuse recovery. But Jung understood the concept decades ago. He just called it something different. He called it the integration of the inferior function. For most empaths, the dominant functions are feeling and intuition. You feel deeply and you perceive patterns, but your inferior functions, thinking and sensing, are underdeveloped. You don't trust logic over emotion. You don't prioritize facts over feelings. And this creates a massive blind spot that manipulative people exploit ruthlessly. But when you go through the shadow integration process, when you're forced to confront the reality of how you've been used, something shifts permanently in your cognitive architecture. Your thinking function comes online with a vengeance, not to replace your feeling, but to protect it. And suddenly you have access to both emotional depth and analytical precision. You can feel someone's pain and simultaneously recognize that they're weaponizing it. You can understand someone's trauma and simultaneously see that they're using it as an excuse rather than doing the work to heal it. You can have compassion for someone's struggle and simultaneously enforce boundaries around their behavior. This is shadow immunity, the ability to recognize manipulation tactics before they take hold, to see emotional extraction disguised as connection, to identify people who mistake your empathy for weakness, and to respond not with emotion but with action, specifically the action of removal. Jung observed that empaths who reach this stage become what he called psychologically sovereign. They no longer need external validation because they develop internal authority. They trust their perception completely because they've tested it against reality and found it accurate. They enforce boundaries unapologetically because they understand that a boundary is not a wall, it's a filter, and the people who respect boundaries are allowed through, while the people who violate them are removed. This creates a very specific pattern that other people find disturbing, which is the empath's quiet exit, no drama, no explanation, no second chances, just a clean, surgical removal of toxic people from their life. And what makes this so psychologically powerful is that it's irreversible once an empath integrates their shadow and develops discernment. They cannot go back to unconscious absorption. They cannot unsee what they've seen. They cannot unknow what they've learned about human nature. Contemporary research from late 2024 shows that this transformation has neurological correlates. Empaths who go through boundary development actually show changes in brain activity, specifically decreased activation in regions associated with people-pleasing and increased activation in areas related to self-protection. This is not emotional hardening. This is psychological maturation. It's your brain finally catching up to what your body has been trying to tell you for years, which is that not everyone deserves access to your energy. Not everyone can be trusted with your heart. Not everyone is capable of reciprocal relationship. Jung emphasized that this is not the end of the empath's capacity for connection. It's the beginning of authentic connection, because now you're only connecting with people who can actually see you, not people who need something from you. You're only investing in relationships where there's mutual respect, not relationships where you're doing all the emotional labor. You're only opening your heart to people who've earned that access through consistent behavior, not people who demand it through emotional manipulation. The transformation that happens during this period of sacred isolation is what Jung called individuation, the process of becoming a whole, integrated individual rather than a fragmented collection of adaptations to other people's needs. And for empaths, this process is particularly intense because you're not just discovering who you are, you're recovering who you were before you learned to sacrifice yourself for survival. There's a version of you that existed before the trauma, before the hypervigilance, before you learned that love means pain and connection means loss. And individuation is about reclaiming that essential self while integrating everything you've learned through suffering. Jung observed that empaths who complete this process emerge with a quality that he described as the wounded healer archetype fully realized. You understand suffering because you've suffered. You understand manipulation because you've been manipulated. You understand trauma because you've lived it. But you're no longer identified with the wound. You've integrated it. You've transformed it. You've used it to develop wisdom and discernment and the capacity to spot unhealthy patterns immediately. This is why empaths who've gone through individuation make such powerful therapists, coaches, teachers, and leaders. They can hold space for others' pain without taking it on. They can witness suffering without needing to fix it. They can offer support without sacrificing themselves. And this is the crucial difference between the unindividuated empath and the individuated one. The unindividuated empath needs to be needed. They derive their sense of worth from being useful. They're addicted to being the savior. And this addiction keeps them trapped in toxic relationships because they unconsciously seek out broken people to fix. But the individuated empath has done their own healing work. They know their worth is inherent, not earned. They understand that helping someone who doesn't want to be helped is not compassion, it's codependency. They recognize that their job is not to save anyone. Their job is to be authentically themselves and allow others to do the same. Recent insights from 2024 and 2025 emphasize what Jung knew, that this transformation changes not just how empaths relate to others, but how others relate to them. When you stop being available for extraction, when you stop performing empathy to keep the peace, when you stop prioritizing everyone's comfort over your own truth, you become what researchers are calling selectively empathetic. You have deep care and genuine concern for people, but you're fiercely protective of your energy and absolutely ruthless about who gets access to it. This selectivity terrifies people who are used to empaths being boundaryless. They interpret your boundaries as coldness when actually it's clarity. They mistake your discernment for judgment when actually it's self-respect. They think you've changed when really you just stopped pretending. And their discomfort with your evolution is not your problem to manage. Jung was emphatic that the individuated person will always make the unconscious person uncomfortable because your presence reminds them of everything they're avoiding in themselves. Your authenticity highlights their performance. Your boundaries expose their manipulation. Your sovereignty threatens their control. So when people say you've changed and they mean it as criticism, you can hear it as confirmation. Yes, you've changed. You've evolved from an unconscious empath who absorbed everyone's pain to a conscious being who chooses where to direct their compassion. And that evolution is not something to apologize for. It's something to protect fiercely. Now let's address the elephant in the room, which is why empaths specifically attract narcissists and energy vampires. Because this is not random. This is not bad luck. This is a psychological pattern that Jung understood through his concept of shadow projection. Every person has a shadow, the parts of themselves they repressed, denied, or refused to acknowledge. And the unconscious mind projects those shadow elements onto others, seeking in external relationships what needs to be integrated internally. For narcissists, the shadow is their vulnerability, their dependence, their need, everything they denied about their own emotional fragility, and they project those disowned parts onto empaths, seeing in you the capacity to feel that they've cut themselves off from, and then they extract it. They use your empathy as a kind of emotional prosthetic. They don't have access to their own feelings, so they consume yours. They can't generate their own emotional regulation, so they rely on you to regulate them. And this creates what Jung called a participation mystique, an unconscious fusion where the narcissist's sense of ability depends entirely on your willingness to absorb their dysregulation. But here's the part that empaths need to understand. You're not an innocent victim in this dynamic. You have your own shadow that's being projected, and your shadow is your power, your anger, your selfishness, your capacity to say no and mean it. Everything you've been taught is unacceptable in yourself, and you project that onto the narcissist. You see in them the freedom to be selfish that you deny yourself, the permission to prioritize their needs that you've never given yourself, the audacity to take up space that you've been conditioned to believe is wrong. And unconsciously you're drawn to them because they represent the parts of yourself you need to integrate, your capacity for healthy selfishness, for protective anger, for unapologetic boundary enforcement. This is why empaths keep attracting narcissists until they do the shadow work. You're trying to learn through relationship what you need to develop in yourself, and the universe will keep sending you the same lesson in different bodies until you finally get it, which is that you don't need to absorb someone's darkness to be valuable. You don't need to fix someone's broken to prove your worth. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to earn love, because love that requires sacrifice isn't love. It's transaction. Jung saw this pattern repeat endlessly in his clinical work. Empaths caught in these trauma bonds, these repetitive cycles of attract, absorb, deplete, repeat. And he recognized that the only way out is through shadow integration. You have to reclaim your power, own your anger, develop your selfishness, not the destructive kind, but the healthy kind. The kind that says my well-being matters, my energy is valuable, my time is precious, my peace is non-negotiable. When you integrate these shadow elements, something extraordinary happens. You become repellent to narcissists. They can sense that you're no longer available for extraction, that you won't absorb their dysregulation, that you have boundaries made of steel wrapped in velvet, and they move on to easier targets. People who haven't done the work, people who still believe that love means suffering and connection means sacrifice. Let's get tactical about what trust actually means for an empath who's been through the awakening, because it's not what most people think. It's not blind faith or benefit of the doubt, or believing the best in people despite evidence to the contrary. That's not trust. That's denial. Real trust for an awakened empath is evidence-based assessment of character over time through consistent behavior. And this is where Jung's concept of the four functions becomes absolutely critical. Most empaths operate primarily through feeling and intuition. You feel your way through life and you intuit patterns. But after the awakening, you develop your thinking and sensing functions. You start paying attention to facts, to data, to concrete observable behavior rather than potential or promises or explanations. This is how you rebuild trust in yourself first, by trusting your observations. When someone shows you who they are through their actions, you believe them immediately. You don't wait for the pattern to repeat 15 times before you acknowledge it. You don't make excuses for behavior that violates your boundaries. You don't rationalize red flags as quirks or growing pains or misunderstandings. You see it, you name it, you respond to it. Contemporary research from late 2024 on empath recovery emphasizes a shift from feeling-based to evidence-based assessment. Researchers are calling the development of psychological discernment, which is different from judgment. Judgment is about labeling someone as good or bad. Discernment is about recognizing whether someone is healthy for you based on how they actually behave. And this requires you to develop what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold multiple perspectives simultaneously, without collapsing into either extreme. You can acknowledge that someone has trauma and also acknowledge that they're using their trauma as a weapon. You can understand why someone behaves the way they do and also decide that understanding doesn't equal acceptance. You can have compassion for someone's struggle and also maintain a boundary that says, I will not participate in your dysfunction. This is the empath's superpower after awakening. You don't lose your empathy, you gain discernment. You can feel everything and choose what to do with those feelings. You're no longer at the mercy of your emotional responsiveness. You're the conscious director of where your energy goes. And this completely changes who you allow into your life. The criteria shifts from who needs me to who reciprocates, from who has potential to who demonstrates growth, from who makes me feel needed to who makes me feel valued. And these are radically different metrics. One keeps you trapped in savior complex dynamics, and the other opens you to actual partnership. When an awakened empath says they don't trust people, what they mean is they don't trust people's words anymore. They trust patterns. They trust behavior over time. They trust consistency between what someone says and what they do. And most people fail this test spectacularly because most people are unconscious. They're not intentionally lying. They genuinely believe they're going to change. They're going to do better. They're going to show up differently. But their behavior reveals the truth of their current capacity. And an awakened empath reads that truth like a book. Here's what Jung understood about the empath's journey that contemporary psychology is only now catching up to, which is that the goal is not to become less empathetic. It's to become more sovereign. Sovereignty means you own your energy completely. You decide where it goes, who has access to it, and under what conditions. And this is different from the walls that traumatized people build. Walls are rigid and defensive and designed to keep everyone out. Sovereignty is flexible and intentional, and designed to let the right people in while keeping the wrong people out. Jung called this the development of the self, capital S, the archetypal center of the psyche that integrates all the parts of who you are into a coherent whole. And for empaths, the self includes both your capacity for deep feeling and your capacity for fierce protection, both your openness to connection and your willingness to walk away, both your compassion for human suffering and your refusal to participate in enabling it. This integration creates what researchers in 2025 are calling the sovereign empath archetype. You're not the wounded healer anymore. You're the conscious healer. You've healed yourself first, and now you operate from overflow rather than depletion. You don't need to fix anyone to feel valuable. You don't need to be needed to know your worth. You don't need external validation because you've developed internal authority. And this makes you absolutely magnetic to healthy people and absolutely repellent to toxic ones. The sovereign empath has a very specific energy signature that healthy people recognize immediately. It says, I am safe to be vulnerable with, I will hold space without judgment. I will see you clearly without trying to change you. But it also says I have boundaries that are non-negotiable. I will remove myself from situations that violate my peace. I will not sacrifice my well-being to maintain your comfort. And this combination of openness and strength, of compassion and boundaries, of empathy and sovereignty, this is what Jung meant by psychological wholeness. Recent insights emphasize that this wholeness is not a destination you arrive at. It's a practice you commit to daily. You practice noticing when you're slipping into old patterns of overgiving. You practice enforcing boundaries, even when it feels uncomfortable. You practice trusting your perception, even when others question it. You practice choosing yourself even when it disappoints people. And over time, these practices become integrated into who you are. They're not something you have to think about anymore. They're your new baseline, your new normal, your new way of being in the world. And here's the beautiful paradox that Jung loved. The more sovereign you become, the more authentic connection becomes possible. Because you're no longer attracting people who need something from you. You're attracting people who appreciate who you are. You're not bonding over trauma and dysfunction. You're bonding over shared values and mutual growth. You're not in relationship to fill each other's voids. You're in relationship to celebrate each other's wholeness. Let's talk about what happens to people in an empath's life when they stop being available for emotional extraction, because this is where the real test happens. This is where you find out who actually values you versus who valued your utility. Jung observed this pattern constantly. When an empath sets boundaries, when they stop overfunctioning in relationships, when they stop being the emotional support system for everyone around them, there's a predictable response from the people who benefited from their boundarylessness. And that response is resistance disguised as concern. They'll tell you that you become cold, that you're not yourself anymore, that they're worried about you, that you used to be so caring, and now you're selfish. And every single one of these statements is a manipulation tactic designed to pull you back into the role of giver while they maintain the role of taker. This is what Jung called the collective shadow, the unconscious agreements that groups make about who gets to be what. And in most social systems, empaths are assigned the role of emotional caretaker. And when you refuse that role, the system destabilizes. People don't know how to relate to you anymore because the entire foundation of the relationship was based on you providing emotional labor while they consumed it. This is the most painful part of the awakening for many empaths. The realization that most of your relationships were transactional, that people didn't actually know you, they knew the version of you that served their needs. And when you stop being that version, they don't even try to know the real you. They just disappear, or worse, they try to convince you that the real you is a problem. Contemporary research from 2024 and 2025 on relationship dynamics confirms what Jung observed, that when one person in a relationship begins individuation, the relationship either evolves or it ends. There's no middle ground. Either the other person is willing to meet you in your growth, to develop their own boundaries and emotional responsibility, to relate to you as a whole person rather than a function, or they're not. And if they're not, the relationship dies, not because you killed it, but because it was never built to survive your evolution into wholeness. Jung was very clear that this pruning of relationships is not only necessary but healthy. He called it the withdrawal projections. You stop projecting your need for validation onto people who can't provide it. You stop projecting your longing for a real connection onto people who are only capable of surface interaction. You stop projecting your hope for reciprocity onto people who are committed to taking. And when you withdraw those projections, you see people as they actually are, and sometimes what you see is that they have nothing to offer a relationship between equals. They only know how to relate in hierarchy. And if you won't be beneath them as their emotional servant, they have no use for you. This is brutal to accept, but Jung emphasized that accepting it is liberation. You are finally free from the exhausting performance of being who everyone needs you to be. You are finally available for relationships that honor who you actually are. And yes, that might mean you have fewer relationships. The awakened empath often goes from having hundreds of acquaintances to having a handful of real friends. But those friendships are profound. They're reciprocal, they're nourishing, they're based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than need and utility. So where does this leave you? The empath who's been to the fire and emerged on the other side, who's integrated their shadow and developed sovereignty and stopped trusting people who've proven themselves untrustworthy. What does life look like now? And this is where Jung's vision becomes almost prophetic, because he understood that the individuated empath doesn't just heal themselves, they become a force for collective healing, not through sacrifice and martyrdom, but through embodiment and example. You show people what's possible when you choose yourself, when you enforce boundaries, when you trust your perception, when you refuse to participate in dysfunction. And this is threatening to people who are still asleep, but it's inspiring to people who are ready to wake up. Your presence becomes a catalyst. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to preach or teach or convince anyone. You just live your truth. You operate from your sovereignty. You engage authentically and withdraw cleanly. And the people who are meant to find will find you, drawn to the energy of someone who's done the work, who's integrated their wholeness, who's moved beyond a victim-savior dynamic into conscious choice. Jung called these people the conscious minority, the individuals who've done the work of individuation and now operate from the self rather than the ego. And he believed that these individuals have a disproportionate impact on the collective consciousness, not through force or persuasion, but through presence, by existing as living proof that another way is possible, that you can be deeply empathic and fiercely boundaried, that you can feel everything and choose wisely, that you can care profoundly and still prioritize yourself. Recent research from 2025 on post-traumatic growth in empaths confirms this. Individuals who've been through the awakening process report not just recovery, but transformation. They describe becoming more themselves than they've ever been, accessing capacities they didn't know they had, living with a depth and authenticity that makes their previous life feel like a performance. They report that the loss of relationships that couldn't survive their growth was not actually a loss, but clearing, making space for connections that honor their wholeness. And they describe a quality of peace that comes from finally trusting themselves completely, from knowing that their perception is valid, that their boundaries are sacred, that their energy is precious, and they get to decide where it goes. This is the empath's revolution, not loud or visible or rewarded by mainstream culture, but seismic in its impact on individual lives and rippling out into collective consciousness. You're not here to fix the broken. You're here to embody the whole. You're not here to absorb the collective shadow. You're here to integrate your own and inspire others to do the same. You're not here to be liked or approved of or understood by everyone. You're here to be authentically yourself and trust that the right people will recognize that authenticity and the wrong people will self. Disclaimer. This video explores psychological patterns in empathic individuals through the lens of Carl Jung's analytical psychology, combined with contemporary research on boundaries, trauma responses, and emotional regulation. While grounded in psychological principles, this content is for educational purposes and personal reflection. It is not a substitute for professional mental health support. If you're experiencing psychological distress or trauma-related symptoms, please seek qualified professional help.